Well, so I guess you started out um, in our two-man and a ghost conversation from before the podcast, talking about the animation style, and that really got you going. So
Oh, the
Um,
animation really got you going.
dude, I'm not gonna lie though. Like, I actually wrote a lot of notes on just the animation for this show because I found it fascinating. Because
yeah,
there,
I kind of figured you would.
what's that supposed to mean? Just that you
That
know me. Um, but yeah, no, like I found it fascinating because there were moments in which it was choppy, but it was like intentionally choppy.
mm,
In order to in order to be comedic. I mean, other times there was times that it was just very much choppy, or like they were just doing like moving their mouth, and it seemed a little lazy. At the same time, it didn't seem necessarily out of place for the show, and I didn't think it was like, oh wow, what shit budget or something like that. Because I don't know, it fit the tone and style of the show. It's not a it doesn't try to take itself incredibly seriously when it comes to its animation.
yeah, and in many ways, the weird permutations that it does is kind of just a sort of visual adaptation of how the show handles itself thematically
Yeah.
as well. Much like you said, it doesn't take itself entirely too seriously, but at the same time, it still does deal with some fairly serious topics.
Yeah, and you can definitely tell because just from the art style itself, none of the characters, like if you compared side by side panels of the characters, I don't think they would even be the same shape for most of this show. Um, you knew what the character who the character was, and you knew what they looked like, but anytime that they moved or animated in any way, they actually didn't really stay. It's it's almost like Ed and Eddie, where like it's constantly jittery and shaky. Except for in this case, it's just that they're like amorphous blobs that are trying to retain a shape. Especially when it comes to like Ozu, he was
That's
constantly changing shape.
that is an unbelievably weird comparison to make, but I get what you mean.
Okay, thank goodness. I knew it was
And
gonna be a weird one. That's why I paused. Um,
but like I kind of understand what you mean in that the animation has this sort of weird sense of flow sometimes. Like I wouldn't say that it's like that all the time because there
no.
are there's a good amount of time in the show where the animation is pretty, like, I don't want to say standard, but like I refer to it as standard in that it's not always like you said. It's not like the characters are like fucking containers of water that are like just sloshing around and are sort of
Yeah,
um, that are jittering around.
and to the show's credit, it's really interesting how they change that up too. Because like sometimes they'll be sloshing around, other times like they'll be like really into the mental metaphors of just like he gets a letter from somebody that he's been in communication with that it's and they've been like sending each other lovely letters, and he turns into a fucking like winged creature of that's like suddenly pink, and he like blows up a little bit and like floats into his room. It's there's very weird stuff like that, but then other times when it's being a little bit more serious, the characters look actually pretty incredibly real sometimes, and just like the way that they're shaped.
Yeah.
And
Um,
the animation is a lot smoother.
yeah, I mean, I understand what you mean. I think that was intentional
No,
on
yeah,
part of the show. Definitely, just as Zach said, it was thematically consistent. Just because we're seeing these different perspectives of these characters in animation wise as well. Like as throughout the story, we're seeing different, like just plot wise, we're seeing different sides of the characters, different sides of their personalities throughout the entire story, and then the animation also kind of we see different sides of them through the animation as well, I guess.
Right,
Kind of like that.
and so as we go through these different you know these different attempts for protag to find his rose-colored campus life, we see all these different lenses through which he tries to view things, and in that sort of sense, it very much visually affects how each episode handles itself. There's always kind of like a fairly consistent undertone, like base, sort of for the visual style,
Yeah.
but each one does bring its own sort of different warping of that each episode as well.
And I also like, just from its style standpoint, something that definitely stood out to me, and obviously is going to stand out to anybody, is that the show's really not afraid to combine a lot of real life images or like real life video with the actual like two-dimensional characters in the show. It's always interesting how they combine that too. Typically, it was like with backgrounds and stuff like that, but then other times, like randomly, it would just be weird stuff in the foreground, and it always comes up as like really weird and strange, but it fits exactly what they're doing. Especially in I saw a lot of that in episode 10, whenever he's stuck going through these rooms, room after room after room. And I think it helped a lot in that episode to like give us this like really strange Twilight Zone-esque kind of bizarreness that he's experiencing himself.
Right, yeah, and it's bizarre enough watching the protagonist, keep smashing through these walls of his 4.5 tatami room, only to go into an almost identical one right next to it. But it's even more unsettling, like just seeing it go through like this really grainy video footage
Mm-hmm.
of going through these different rooms, and it's almost as though like we're actually going through with him in this sort of sense, and it's incredibly disorienting.
Yeah, and I think it matched up with how exactly he was feeling in that episode very,
Hmm.
very well.
Hmm.
Yeah, it did a very good job of making me fairly uncomfortable during that sequence, which good on it for that.
Yeah, I like a lot of the different stuff that they did for the art style and the animation as well for this show. It was super cool. I also like how this show is basically the Endless Eight, only good.
Whoa.
Fuck off.
Whoa.
But really,
The Endless Eight was a masterpiece.
the Endless Eight could have been. We've talked about this before. It could have been good. It just needed to be shorter because it was the exact same thing repeated over and over and over and over again. In this one, it's taking the same exact idea of like taking of the same character running through the same running through different. This character is constantly trying to find this end result, which is this rose-colored college life that he wants, and he keeps running into very similar failings where he just constantly keeps fucking up and not doing what he's supposed to do. um and
Also,
okay, yeah, you go ahead.
we keep saying this character, and if you haven't watched the show, we do say this because this is another one of those shows where the protagonist just doesn't have a name.
Yeah, it's like Jin Rui where the protagonist doesn't have a name. And it's
Yeah.
I guess it's because in the original story that this is based off of, he's just it always speaks in the first person.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a choice. It adds to that uniqueness. It adds to that weirdness in the show, though. Is that like when you think back on it, you're like, wait, what the fuck? Yeah, he didn't have a name.
Yeah, I tried to look up like his name because I was trying to make like notes and stuff, and I was like, what the heck is his name? Like they haven't given it to us, I don't think. And I go look, and I'm like, oh, no, they haven't. You're right. Well, shit.
Yeah, I was wondering if it was going to be exactly like Jinrui, in which there actually was a reason that she didn't have a name. But in this case, I guess it was just he just didn't have a name. It wasn't important.
Yeah, no,
It
and
didn't really matter.
I think that's again, I feel like that's thematically important to the show as well, because the protagonist is like from the outset like consistently worried about like completely wasting his time. In almost every episode, we get to this point where he's like, 2 years have passed from my college life, and I feel like I completely wasted them away in some way, shape, or form. And
Yeah.
there's this consistent thing of, he is so stressed out and so over occupied with this idea that he's wasting time and not doing things the way that he could have or should have or anything like that. And so with that sort of degree of fixation on this shit, it's like something like his name isn't quite as important to him as how he spends his time.
And I also think on that same note, it was interesting that he didn't have a name for the reason of because it seemed like where he keeps coming back to the same place and then choosing to go to a different club or choosing to do a different thing. I felt like the name wasn't that important for that reason as well, because whenever he goes back, and then he goes to a different club, we see that all the shit that he did the first time around happens again in the exact same way. It's just Ozu is doing it by himself now instead of both him and the main character, for the most part. And I thought that was really interesting because all this shit still happens even though he didn't have anything to do with it. Meaning that, yeah, he wasn't that important to the end result.
Mm-hmm.
Which
Right.
I think fits the fact that he didn't have a name either, because in the end, who was he? But whenever he went through that life, it didn't matter.
Right. And, it's really interesting to think about the fact that, if you consider it from that perspective, it doesn't really matter because, again, what he does in the grand scheme of things, he's going to get to this same sort of mental state, the same sort of point, regardless of how he goes about this. In one frame of mind, anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, dude. Show's cool.
Yeah. He talks to his dick for a couple episodes.
Yeah,
does.
that does happen.
I loved that there was a personification of his I want to say it's absolutely his penis. He even calls it a Johnny, which was a nice callback to a previous podcast we've done. But I also like it because it very much is just basically his sex drive personified, and it was really funny. I like that a lot. I also like that, like, whenever they're about to do the dirty on the couch, her tongue just turns into like something from a Looney Tunes character. It's just like I'm like, what is going on?
Yeah, that was very. It was weird.
There's a lot of moments in the show that like take me for a surprise, simply just because the animation gets real fucking weird for a second, and they even call back to it too, because like in a scene after that, like she licks them like that, and it's really weird, and then like Ozu's just like, did she lick you on the face? Yeah, she does that. It's like, what?
Well, and like a couple episodes beforehand, he had been talking about, Haneke and saying like, yeah, she's this dentist, she's a dental hygienist, and she gets drunk sometimes, and if she does, she's probably gonna lick your face. And I'm like, that's a weird detail. And then several episodes later, here we are, and I'm like, oh.
And she's licking his face.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that was just one of the weird moments of this show, but the whole show was very weird a lot of the time.
It was weird in a good way for me, though. I genuinely enjoyed how just strange and awkward it was.
Yeah, it is a consistently odd show. Sorry.
Yeah. I don't hate the fact that it was odd. It actually made it very, as I said earlier, unique and stood out a lot because of that. Just the bizarre antics this show went through, like talking to his Johnny all the time.
Having full conversations with his penis.
Yeah. I can't say that I've ever done that before.
On a horse.
Yeah. Can't say I've ever done that before.
It was just so... I just kept getting these awful flashes of, wow, this is just a really weirdly animated Woody. from Toy Story.
Oh no!
It'd be even worse if
I
you were
mean-
thinking of like that creepy Japanese version of Woody with like
I
the
mean, if you're
super
thinking
creepy
about
face.
if you think about it, it was his Woody, I guess, if you want to call it
Oh
that.
my god.
I mean,
Oh no.
oh no!
it was those weird moments that I kind of live for, which is another reason why I absolutely love the old grandma that keeps taking his money for fortunes. It was fantastic because every single, except for, it was like we started off with her like behaving very similarly, and then you can even tell by the end of it where she keeps going back in time. She seems to kind of get that she's going back in time. She just starts paraphrasing it and just not giving a shit and not even being at the specific location. She's just like meets him on the street and says, "Hey, you need to do the thing. All right, that'll be some money."
Yeah,
And
just
then, like,
this
runs off.
This creepy old fortune teller lady is just like, hey, you have some serious talent, man, but you feel like you're wasting it away. I just know it. So you gotta grasp this opportunity. And then, yeah, it becomes like each episode, like her fee raises like 1,000 yen
That was a great
each
thing.
time.
I liked that you could tell which episode you were on by the amount of money that she was charging him. That was
There was-
really funny.
There was one time that got me though, because
Yeah, because
one
they go
episode,
back.
yeah, because she's like, okay, that'll be 6,000, and I'm like, wait a minute, this is like episode 8. We already did this, and then she's like 2 minutes later, she's like, oh yeah, here's an additional 2,000.
Yeah, she actually goes off and then physically comes back and takes the 2,000 from him and then runs off.
And I was like, oh yeah, there they go, there it is.
It was really funny. That's why I was sad that she wasn't. She was in episode 10, but there was no money. We never saw like the amount of money transferred between the two, and then she wasn't. And then she didn't talk to him in episode 11 because it was the end, and he kind of broke the loop.
Yeah.
I missed her. I always looked forward to that.
You look forward to people taking your money right out of your pocket.
I looked forward to the hilarious grandma that just keeps on robbing this poor guy blind.
Oh, grandma. But
I loved all the characters actually. It was cool too. I wrote in my notes that something that I liked about the show is that a lot of the characters, and they even commented on it a little bit later with like a really cool visual show of like taking a two-dimensional character and they were stating human beings are supposed to be complex. They're more than just 2D, they're 3D. And it's cool because they even like change the perspective and then add 3 dimensions onto a two-dimensional object. And that was really neat. But it was true. All of the characters in the show are actually very believable, and they're a lot more complex than what they seem to be. It was like even for the most
believable to a degree.
right. I mean, there's
Like,
crazy shit that happens.
I feel like you would be hard pressed to meet a guy that has a rock wall made out of silicon breasts.
Okay. Yes.
I haven't met one yet.
But
I don't think you ever will.
But as a character, the way the way that he generally behaved around the other characters, the way that everybody interacted, it was very believable in a sense.
Right.
And that's something that I enjoyed. And I also like that they even took like, because they could have just made it a simple show with simple characters, but like, because like you have a loner that just feels like they're wasting away their life. That's a trope that's been done. You have like a conniving bully character that's just kind of like abusing the main character, and then you also have a standoffish bookie girl that's in some kind of nerdy club. Like those are kind of tropes, but at the same time, it's like the way that they like, okay, well that's a character archetype, but then let's do a lot more interesting things with it. And really flesh out the character and make it a lot more interesting. That's something that I liked a lot. And especially how each of those characters then interacted with each other and changed over the course of the show. Which is weird to say about a show that keeps going back in time. The characters actually changed just because it was a different situation, you saw them behave differently.
Yeah, the perspective changed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if we're going to talk about like characters changing, perhaps one of the most fascinating and most deeply interesting parts about the show to me was like the brief visual transformation that Ozu got in the last episode of the show. It was fascinating because like there's straight from episode 1, like Ozu is described as looking like some kind of fucking monster, and he does. Like he looks entirely unnatural facially.
Yeah.
Like just like weird, like sharp teeth and eyes, like no eyebrows, like no other facial features except for these like big blobular eyes and just like fucking shark teeth and shit.
Yeah.
And it just looks so odd. And it's because, through all these permutations, like just the protagonist is like, yep, invariably, whenever my life fucks up somehow, it's always because of Ozu. Meeting Ozu was my first mistake and my greatest. And that's a phrase that's repeated I don't know how many times. But it's really interesting once he finally gets, into his supreme Groundhog Day kind of loop where he's just going through the hundreds of these fucking 4.5 tatami rooms, and he finally realizes, oh, shit wasn't messed up.
What?
You didn't hear me at all?
No, did you hear me at all?
No, I didn't. Okay. I was saying that it was also interesting because in episode 10 and 11, it felt like he came to the conclusion that it wasn't Ozu that fucked up his life, it was himself. And he kind of had to deal with that.
It's weird because that's exactly what I just talked about for a solid minute as well.
Okay, good.
We both went into
detail. We all covered the same ground. Great.
We both went into detail, and then all of a sudden Discord was like, "Yeah, you guys are just gonna talk in a room by yourselves." Hey, it's episode 10.
You know what?
Isn't this thematic though?
Isn't
this
that
spot
fitting?
on?
Anyways, fucking Discord.
We were all connected, but we were all not connected because we were all in a 4.5 tatami room for a split second.
But
Pretty much.
It's an interesting thing that, like, in that way he kind of learned that Ozu was his closest friend, and in that in actuality, while Ozu was kind of a dick, he wasn't like a completely evil spirit like he was originally defined as.
Right. And it was just nice that, in the final episode, Ozu doesn't look like a weird onion-headed monster anymore.
Yeah.
Like, he looks like a regular-ass person.
I would even argue that I felt like in a couple of the previous episodes before that, his teeth even got shorter. They weren't as like jagged knives anymore as they were in whenever the series first started. I almost felt like in episode 10.
I feel like there was at least one point in one episode where he did look semi-normal, like just maybe for a split second or something.
But I just thought in time.
I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then when you get to the end of the show, it's like
he actually does look normal. Yeah,
so I was like, wait a minute, maybe we were seeing the better side of him for a split second.
And I also thought it was nice that in the hospital they kind of switched roles, because Ozu is the one that's being nice now, and then the protagonist is actually like basically trying to kill him with kindness, and so like he gets the sharp jagged teeth, even though he's still being a good person and helping him out. It's like Ozu doesn't want the help, and so he gets the jagged teeth.
It's just it's a nice full circle for the show.
Yeah,
and it's really neat to see this, because like it's funny how we keep going back to the visuals, because I feel like they're such an integral part of the show, more so than the visuals are for many other anime as well.
They really are,
which is weird to say, because anime is obviously a visual medium, but the way that these things develop, if they follow hand in hand, again thematically with the show, the way these things develop shape our perceptions and shape our understanding of the events that happen in the show. And so it's nice to see how the show continually develops its style and how it decides to show us what is happening as it goes forward.
And I would also like to think, because I was thinking about this in the show, because I was thinking I could not tell you another similar anime to this one. Really, it's a bit too unique in its own regard. It whenever I first started watching, I almost felt like it was Madhouse's try at being Shaft. But then as I kept watching the show, I was like, no, that's not correct at all. Because they're very different in their own way, and I think a part of that is that this style, what they decide to show you on screen. Sure, like whenever they're doing Monogatari, they'll show something on screen, and it's neat because it's like, hey, it's a sort of metaphor. But then a lot of that is also just kind of junk and like beautifully, aesthetically pleasing while the main character is monologuing. In this, anytime the main character is monologuing, what is being presented to you is either a direct metaphor or an actual showing of what is occurring. And I thought that was a lot more interesting, because like there was some really cool animation going on, and the animation is directly related to metaphorically to what he's talking about a lot of times.
Right. And I feel like some people could potentially say that the animation feels like sporadic and crowded and just so cacophonous that it's distracting. But like you said, it really does do a solid job of making very consistent, solid, observant use of its screen time. There's hardly a point where we just get some, background on there for, a good chunk of time that doesn't have anything to do with what they're actually talking about. Like there's consistently some effort to, tie the visual and the story together.
And I think it's interesting that you mentioned time. That was something that I put in my notes, was that even though we keep going back in time in a sense, and he has to, the way that they did is that they reintroduced a lot of similar information over and over again, but I felt like the style of the show made it work out very well, because while we also get what seems to be repeated animation and what seems to be like a lot of repeated lines, because the main character goes through them so fucking fast, it never really felt to me that we were wasting time on something. Like the Endless Eight absolutely, with Haruhi, absolutely made me feel like we're wasting time. You could have just gone through this very quickly, get to like what's new, and then move on. In this, that's not the case. It's like when at the beginning of each episode, like he always opens up each one very similarly about like first day of college, and then he picks up a pamphlet for what club he's going to do. It takes like 20 seconds, and then we're into the show, and it's super fast, and you get all the information that you need.
Yeah, and I mostly agree that works for the like episodes 2 through 11.
Yeah.
Yeah, so episode 1, I had a little bit of a problem with that. Well, for one, you don't know what's going on, and obviously that's going to be a barrier entry with any show that's like this. Very strange.
But you're also new to the pace too.
Yeah, and I think that makes the barrier of entry for the show. Take, for example, someone that hasn't, someone that's, let's say they're well versed in anime, but let's say that they're not like ready for this kind of show, or that they're not, or they're not informed about this type of show, or that, maybe they've seen like maybe 30 or 40 anime and they saw, oh, this one's got a good score, I'm going to try it out. And it's thematically different from, it's not only thematically different, it's just different all around from a lot of other anime. And then you jump into this and you get all this information thrown at you. The dialogue's going at light speed. You don't have any idea what's going on.
Yeah, especially the first episode. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm talking about the first episode specifically here. It wouldn't be unusual, and I say that because I kind of experienced it just a little bit. No. I just feel like it wouldn't be unusual for someone to look at this show and be like, what the fuck just happened? And then they'd be like, well, that was weird. I don't think I want to watch any more of that. And it just creates this barrier of entry that it would be very hard for someone to get into it.
Yeah, I do sort of have to agree with you there, because it didn't happen to me in any future episodes, but there were numerous times in episode 1 where I had to like pause and I'm like, stop.
Yeah.
You went way too fucking fast. What did you just say?
You have to back it up and then pause and then pause and then pause and then pause to try and get all the information.
It is going like the protagonist like you said, Matt, speaks at such an incredible speed, and is and it's not like he's just doing like short little choppy sentences here and there. Like he is verbose. He has a lot
Yes.
to say.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so it's like it is an absolute information overload. And again, sort of thematically relevant, but I also don't want to just say that and be like, oh, it's it's a story. Like you're right. It does create in some ways a distinct barrier for entry, and it's
Yeah.
kind of like
Yeah.
it's kind of rough for me to justify that for a first episode, but at the same time,
Like,
don't
and
know.
after episode 1, it was just fine. Like, I was okay with it because some of that information we were given was repeated.
Mhm.
Like, we get to see it several times later on. It's fine.
He also
Well, and the
speaks a
other
lot
thing-
slower after
yeah,
episode
he
1.
slowed the fuck
Yeah.
down.
Yeah, I mean he's still fast, but he speaks a lot slower. I want to make an argument that for the audience that this show was presented to, that is natively Japanese and understands the Japanese language, this may actually be a good way to do it because you get the feeling that they seem to be wanting to present the audience, which is just utter fucking confusion and a lot of information overload intentionally, so that you're like, what the fuck is going on? And in the animation, you're like, the fuck is going on? And
Right.
I think that
Yeah.
was intentional. And for the native speaking Japanese people that don't need to read subs, this actually isn't that bad, especially because you can listen and also watch the animation, which was something that I had a hell of a time
But-
doing in that first episode, because like you can't
wait.
see any of the information because I'm just deathly trying to catch up to what the fuck this guy is saying. So it's either going to require a lot from your audience, and I think I agree with you there. Like if I spoke Japanese and I could understand Japanese, I think it would be a lot better. But for somebody that doesn't and is forced to sit here and read the subs, unless we watch the dub, I think they made a dub of this. At that point, it would be it's almost too much in that first episode.
Yeah, and I actually have a twofold question from, and I don't really expect a really hardcore answer. This is just me thinking as you were talking. So 2 questions. One, does the dub actually reflect the fast-speaking audio in their audio? I would like to know that. And number 2, I wonder how complex the Japanese is to understand, because this is apparently based on a campus novel, according to Wikipedia. So if this isn't, yeah, it's basically just a novel that is written around university life.
Oh, okay.
Just to interject briefly, there is no dub.
No,
Okay.
I thought there was.
No. Funimation has dubbing. Funimation has some sort of U.S. rights, but there's no dub for it.
Okay. Well, that answered that question.
That's interesting.
And that is as of late 2016.
Okay. And the question number 2 that I have is, how complex is the Japanese? Since I understand it is a novel, usually they have complex kanji, especially for a show like this. I wouldn't be surprised if it did. And I understand that like the Japanese language is like, there's a lot of kanji, like in Monogatari, for example, there's a lot of kanji that never get used, like in everyday life. So a lot of people that watch that show don't even know them that natively. Just it'd be like seeing big words here that we can only find in the dictionary.
Yeah.
Right.
I wonder how many of those types of like characters and language was used in the first episode of the show. And how easy is it for a native Japanese person to understand the first episode going that fast is what I'm asking.
Yeah,
And it is a good question,
mm-hmm.
but I don't think it's one that any of us has an
No,
answer
but
to.
I didn't expect an answer. I was just posing that as a question.
It's a situation in which I feel like, because I can't give a definite answer, but I feel like given the choice of words in the subtitles that we saw, I would feel like most likely they are complex kanji. They're complex words in Japanese in order to intentionally add to them more of that confusion that it seems like we're supposed to feel. But I mean that's guesstimation. Just judging off of what the subtitles are.
It was just something I thought about after I got done with the couple episodes. After I started understanding the whole scheme of the show, I thought about that. So I thought it was interesting.
Although I feel like
Mhm.
Monogatari, at least if we're going to do a comparison, I felt like Monogatari definitely had a lot more complex language than this show did.
Yeah, I would agree.
And I feel like that's
Just overall, but I don't have any
yeah.
proof of that.
I think that's mostly just because they're going for two different things. It's like this one, the first episode, Information Overload, they might have been going for a little bit more complex language, but then as it keeps going, they're kids in college. They're supposed to be intelligent, and so like it's not trying to force feed you a bunch of simple words. They're supposed to be. But at the same time, I also think that like it was a lot more down to earth maybe in its language a lot of other times because that's just how people talk. Whereas in Monogatari, they're intentionally being weird and complex and intentionally trying to like speak philosophical and intelligent.
Yeah, this show. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Monogatari is very deep. But I mean, not to say this show isn't deep, but yeah, the language, the usage of language is very different. Which is that's the reason I posed that question. I was just interested.
Yeah,
I was interested.
I think it's a good question. I would love to hear an answer at some point.
Yeah, like I mean, there's definitely an attempt to some degree of more complex language here, but I feel like this is more sort of natural kind of conversational complex language,
Yeah.
whereas Monogatari in some ways tries to be as deep as the Mariana Trench and doesn't always pull that off. But hey.
That's Monogatari for you.
It stoops to like Kingdom Hearts levels of edge where it's like trying to be deep and then just kind of falls short and becomes teen angst.
Maybe not quite that far, but I get your idea.
Yeah, I'm not saying that Monogatari is teen angst. I'm saying that it's like it's trying to be deep but misses the mark a bit.
I'm picking up what you're throwing down.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
I'm not
hopefully
trying to,
everyone else is as well.
I'm not trying to shit on Kingdom
certainly
Hearts
hope
or
so.
Monogatari. Gosh, there was a couple of other things I was trying to think that I really liked about the show. I will say sometimes they do say, speaking of language, you remember the episode in which he joins the club that they're all speaking English and the English Conversational Club? I love that club because all it was that somebody comes up to the front room and speaks English, and it's almost like classic like 1920s 30s the beatnik movement in America. It was almost like that where they're trying to be cool and like and catchy, and then everyone's like, oh, wonderful phrasing, but it like makes no fucking sense.
Also a weird comparison, but I also see where you're coming from with this one as well.
All right.
No. Like I totally get what you're saying. Like it's.
I don't, but that's okay.
It was an interesting. I don't know. It was a very funny scene. I think anytime that they would talk about that. As somebody who natively speaks English, especially because they had like weird things. They're like, oh, don't worry about it. English is all about feeling. You don't got to worry about that grammar. And I was like, wait a minute, what?
Well, the way we're going sometimes.
I mean, yeah,
that's kind of our trajectory.
You could argue like slang, but even Japanese has slang. It's like almost every language typically has some type of like non-traditional form to it, but I wouldn't define the entire language as that.
That's pretty lit, fam.
Oh my god. Get out.
Kill yourself.
Okay, I'll make a note of that.
It was a funny scene. Oh, that's all I wanted to say. Since we were talking about language, I was
you're right. It was funny.
That the weird Scientology herbal life fucking episode was fantastic for its own reasons.
There is a lot of just episodes in this show that I felt like that they brought up. Like there was a thematic thing that outside of the main thematic thing, there was something else that was always there that I felt like the show, it used it to obviously like bring it to our attention. Mm-hmm. Like the cult pyramid scheme weird thing.
They have the health food, the organic health food pyramid scheme.
Oh gosh, that was great.
Yeah, like it brings that to our attention, and it's like it doesn't really make a commentary on it anywhere in the episode. It kind of does. Because it's obviously framed it.
Yeah, in showing it the way that they do, and framing it that way, I think that's their commentary.
Yeah, but it doesn't like directly like talk about it in the episode dialogue or any.
No, but I thought that was a good way to approach it, because like the dialogue was focused on telling the story that I wanted to tell, and it was just these fun little jabs at like making fun of pyramid schemes and the people that fall into them, and also like people that fall in love with creepy fucking dolls. Um, it was just interesting jabs at like different strange parts of society.
Yeah. For example, there's the episode where he's like a mafia kind of thing.
Yeah.
And they frame like
with like the repossession sort of club thing.
Yeah, there's that. They frame that a certain way. All the episodes 6 through 8, they have the different romance kind of stories and how those are framed by the main character and viewed by other people.
It's almost played as parody, because like he makes fun of the fact of people communicating via letter but never seeing each other. It's like catfishing in modern times. That's what that would be. And then like the weird falling in love with an inanimate object kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think the show, as I said, it kind of puts its own framing on those topics, depending on how the scene's framed and how the scene's portrayed, but it's never portrayed via dialogue. What the show actually thinks about these topics. It's just presented to us to go, hey, this is the thing, we want you to kind of think about it, but we're not going to talk about it.
Yeah.
And I appreciated that, actually. I like it when the show doesn't say, hey, here's a thing, think about it. Here's our view. Think about that.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like it's trying to force your view upon it. It's more interesting whenever they leave it up to interpretation on some.
Because they're just such bizarre situations. It's just so like just the one, for instance, where Ujogasaki hires Protag to be the bodyguard for his sex doll girlfriend or something of that.
Which, when that girl stood up, I fucking freaked. I'm like, so glad I didn't wake up my roommates.
It's such a fucking weird episode in series of scenes, and it's like I don't feel like it's necessarily like commentary or anything like that. It's just like I feel like it is just playing on the absolute absurdity of the situation. It's like, how do you even fucking get to this point?
At the same time, I felt like the commentary wasn't necessarily on the doll itself, but on the relationships and the issues surrounding them. Especially in a situation in which you are torn between 3 different individuals, and it's like, why did you even get here in the first place? And why couldn't you dedicate yourself to one?
Yeah. It's like, how do you even come to this point where you are torn between an inanimate object, a person you've never met, and a real ass person that is about to get down your pants? Like,
when you frame it like that, I mean, that's a pretty. Do you have to pick one in that scenario?
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, I'm not saying that it's a point where in which you have to pick one. It's like, how do you even get to this? Like, what series of events brought you here?
And even the show doesn't pick one, so it wasn't important to them either.
Yeah, it's like, I don't want to do any of these. It's like, I want this one. But he's like, no, okay, that wasn't so great. Let's try this one. Okay, that was a fucking bomb too. Let me try one more. And then you're just like, fuck it.
Whoa, when you frame it like that, it's almost kind of like, and sorry, it was just the way you phrased it. It made me think of this. It's the fact that maybe it's trying to make a commentary on like, having relationships in college. Like, things are kind of happen like that sometimes, where you try to get with somebody and you realize, well, that didn't work. So you try something different with someone else, Maybe that's what it was trying to comment on.
No, but that's exactly what it is trying to do, because like in that particular 3-episode arc, it wasn't commenting on the clubs or the people involved in the clubs necessarily. In that 3 episode arc, it was directly commentating on the actual relationships that he was in. And I think you're right. I think that was the focus of it, is that college relationships in general, different archetypes of individuals that you may meet, um, in a sense, and just trying to experiment in that way. And that's why he kept going back in time, because he was like, well, that didn't work out, let me try a different relationship. And that was his way of trying the different relationship, was going back in time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I felt it was a direct commentary on relationships in college. I think that's exactly what it was trying to do, and I thought it was a relatively clever way to do it. That said, it seems a bit odd to have a. I mean, it's an odd show, but it seems a bit odd to have a relationship to a doll, one, but then two, to equate that to having a relationship with two very real women, or supposedly very real women. That felt a bit odd to me. At the same time, the way that they in the end approached it, I felt was not insulting in any way, especially because this show generally does respect its female cast, which I appreciated a lot. They're well-rounded characters themselves, and it's not always the end result is to get the girl or something like that, and they don't madly fall in love with him either.
Right, because especially in that like span of 3 episodes, there, even though they are centered around, oh man, which one is protag going to pick, or like how is this gonna ultimately fall out from under him? It's never framed in such a way that like the actual female cast is being objectified in a certain way,
No,
like made to be just
yeah.
like a means to an end. It's always like, okay, well, these are 3 very distinct, you know, situations necessarily, not
Right, and it was just that the cast itself, because we have a small cast and we have had since the beginning, the cast themselves fill out the roles. It's almost as if it's almost like whenever you go to a different type of show in which like where it's episodic, and it's like you have the same amount of characters, and then you have like a different episode in which they're all at a masquerade and they're role playing a different character. It's the same cast, but they're behaving and acting in different situations.
mm-hmm.
And I felt like that was kind of it, which I think is an interesting way to do it. Again, it's weird that they would equate a relationship with a inanimate object with an actual woman, but at the same time, it's like I felt like the way that they actually respected the character herself was a good. I thought that they did a good job on that part.
I mean, sometimes life throws you some curveballs, stuff that you couldn't even think of.
Yeah, and to be honest, it's like it's not like the show is trying to make a point about relationships with women in that sense. It's just trying to make a point about relationships, and it was using a doll as a stand-in for a particular type of relationship.
Yeah, and honestly, like, if a lot of this is a focus of a quote unquote campus novel and a sort of reflection on perhaps the relationships that we form in this form of time of university or things of that nature, that one particular part where he is trying to romance Kaori, the human doll, there is this one sense where you can look at it like, oh, he fell in love with the doll. Okay, I mean, if that's your thing, go for it. But then it's also you could look at it in this way like, oh hey, I've known people in college that don't get out with a lot of people necessarily, but they sort of quote unquote fall in love with these sort of things they like to do or objects they like to interact with.
Yeah,
and
it's
their relationships form around these sort of things that they do just by themselves. So there's less like social interaction.
yeah, it's instead of dedicating yourself to a relationship with a real life person, it's escapism in a sense.
Well, and I don't necessarily think it even has to be escapism, man.
Escapism is kind of framed negatively in my mind.
Yeah,
when you use
like
that word. I don't think this is necessarily negative.
Okay,
I think,
well, I didn't necessarily mean it in a negative way. I just
yeah. But I mean, like,
yeah,
there was a time, in when I was in college where I had a good bit of friends, but I was also this really shy little nerd lord, and so instead of necessarily going out and hanging out with folks, I sit around and just play video games for hours at a time, after I did my work and shit. And
Yeah.
so for a time, like, my relationship, my deep love and romance was with these things, and not necessarily people per se.
Yeah.
And not to say that that's like the only focus of what this is supposed to be. It's just one particular interpretation. But that was something that I was thinking about a lot during that episode. I was like, oh, yeah, well, on one hand, this is a very bizarre story of how our protag got into this weird situation where he is fallen head over heels with this very realistic doll.
yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I actually did not think about that. Like just using the doll as a stand-in for something you like to do or a hobby or something.
yeah.
That's an interesting interpretation. I didn't think about that.
And honestly, I think there's a lot of different interpretations that you can do. One of them that I considered while watching was not necessarily falling in love with an inanimate object, but falling in love with beauty rather than the person behind that beauty. Basically, putting something literally on a high shelf, and that being your relationship with them, not necessarily, and that's and not necessarily like having deep conversations with the person, getting to know them on a personality basis, but simply idolizing them in that sense. And he kind of very much did for that doll. I felt that was a way that you could interpret it.
Right.
Yeah, I kind of see that. Yeah.
Yeah. I kind of saw that in part when he was considering romancing the author Keiko Higuchi.
Yeah,
Was not actually an author.
The long distance relationship.
Yeah, which ended up just being a very long con.
Yeah, it's
by
very
Ozu.
much a catfish is what it is, and I thought
Yeah.
that was a good idea too, because I don't know if there's that many stories that actually talk about that. Just the fact that like you can have a relationship with somebody, but if you've never met them, like they could be entirely fake the entire time.
Well, and there is that, but the way I was sort of viewing it was, this whole time as our protag is, exchanging letters with this, fictitious Keiko, on one hand, he is absolutely head over heels with her, but also a lot of this sort of love and a lot of the enjoyment that our protag gets out of this is when he is vastly exaggerating the events of his life,
Yes.
saying, he's an action star when in fact he just took part in a Sentai club, or that he is, an education, he's a conversationalist educator of English for his peers when in fact he's just part of the English Conversational Club,
Right.
and things like that. And so, again, it is sort of like you said, this love of like the beauty of the relationship, because he views Keiko as this idealized, woman, or this idealized, person that he loves. And she's idealized not just because of the way he envisions her, but she's also idealized because she allows him to envision himself in a sort of way that he wants
in the way that
as well.
in the way that he
Mhm.
wants to be, and he even tries to he even makes a mention of that, I remember, in which he talks about that he has embellished himself, but he embellished himself in the way that he wanted to be. And by the end of it, whenever Keiko was the fake girl's name.
Correct.
Okay. In by the end of it, where Keiko wanted to meet up with him, it was a situation in which like he was like, "Oh shit, I've been lying," and he tried to make it the truth. He tried to like fast forward his plans to like be that person that he wanted to be, but he just couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really interesting dialogue within this show in just like the way that they present things. Even on the non-relationship one, it was just they dedicated 3 episodes to that one. It was each one was an interesting take on it.
Yeah, and that's what I was just saying. Like, it's just there's a lot of aspects like that. This show is just like, hey, here's the thing. we're not going to comment on it, but you think about it for a little bit, and we're just going to go on with the show.
Right. And ultimately, like, the more I think about the show, the more I kind of gravitate towards these sort of things like, hey, yeah, these are a lot of really interesting topics that we could talk about. But, ultimately, a lot of the things that we could discuss about the show are kind of just conversations that we could have about life in general. Like, they wouldn't necessarily have to be spurred on, just in like a vacuum from, the Tatami Galaxy. And I guess in a lot of ways, I sort of appreciate how it does that, and that, it's sort of a catalyst for us to really think a lot about our lives, because like I was watching this and I was reflecting a lot on it, because I can't tell you how many times, around like the end of undergrad or, in grad school or things like that, I think back on certain specific little details like, shit, why did I do this? Or, why did I, foster this relationship with this person? Or, why didn't I go and, do X or Y or something? And, really, like, I'm sort of at this point where I'm like at around, say episode 11 protag, where it's like, okay, well, I'm content with where things are now, and I don't want to do this sort of like Groundhog Day sort of loop to it. So it was really interesting for me to be able to like see this kind of internal discussion I've had with myself kind of reflected through this show.
Yeah, and I mean, I noticed that as well. I even wrote that something similar to that in my notes, just thinking about, my experiences with, university or college or whatever, and I'm just thinking about that and thinking about some of the situations he's in. And I'm like, oh yeah, yep, I see where you can get that. And it's interesting that you bring that up about being content near the end of the episode, because I mean, I feel like I'm content right now. But this is an interesting comment by Wrong Every Time, or Bobda, I guess, if you know him by that name.
Oh, yeah.
He wrote an article about Tatami Galaxy, and
awesome.
I think he puts it a really good way when he says, "Our lives are only prisons if we view them that way." Life. Let's see. What does she realize is that his dreams of a rose-colored life have only blinded him to the beautifully colored lives he's been living all along. Life is not meant to be sought or measured. Life is meant to be lived. That is a quote from the article.
Man, that guy's so good with words.
I know.
It was a great way to put it, though. Like that's very much true about what this show seems to be saying by the end of it.
Yeah, and it was just I found that article and I was thinking, yeah, I mean, that's kind of basically how the protagonist in the show feels. I kind of feel like I've gone through this sort of 11 episode phase myself. So
yeah, kind of as you said, before we started recording, I think we've all been in that sort of 4.5 Tatami Galaxy at one point or another.
Yeah, we're just kind of stuck in our own prison that we've put ourselves in, and we just don't know how to get out. And it's a situation in which you just kind of need to understand like who you are, what you're doing, and then like kind of rethink the way that you're thinking about it.
Rethink your thinking. Also, kind of an unrelated note and completely contrasting with everything I just said.
Yeah.
I kind of want a 4.5 tatami room.
Matt, no.
You would want a 4.5 tatami room?
At least like get a little bit larger.
No. Well, it's tough because that's symmetrical. Like they talk about this in the show. 4.5s are perfect squares.
Yeah, but like once you get to the 6 tatami, like things get a little weird. Now you could always go with the 2 tatami, which is also still a square.
Yeah, but that's really small. So the 4.5 is like this perfect balance of like keeping everything enclosed and like comfy, but still having like a tight space.
I don't know. I lived in basically one of those because of that efficiency apartment. I gotta say, it's not all that's cracked up to be. Just having
That's because it didn't have Tatami mats. That's the problem.
It's not enjoyable to being in that tiny of a room for an incredibly long time. For a little bit, sure, that's fine. But I don't know.
Actually, I think my room might be 4.5. Actually, it's pretty
about that same
square.
size, yeah.
It's about that size, actually. I would say.
I don't know.
Yeah, but
I do like it in here.
Matt,
It's
let me
comfy.
let me pose the question
part of
to
it's
you.
like,
Would you like to also be living in that apartment complex where the walls are so fucking thin that you can hear the people next to you making love? Like,
No, but
and they even talk
yeah.
about like how it's so run down. It looks like Kowloon City, which I actually did know about. That's a really fucking cool topic. If you've never heard of that place, it is fascinating. It's very,
no, I haven't heard of that actually.
it's secluded, kind of like it was originally like a almost apartment complex, but then it just kind of kept building and building on top of itself, and it's so like the hallways are so tiny, the rooms are so small, and it's so run down. But it's like everybody there knows each other and everybody's neighbors, and they all kind of watch out for each other. And then the Chinese government tried to plow through it, and they're like, no, and they stood their ground. So it's just like standing there, and it's so fascinating to look at. Just the culture and everything that's so secluded in that area. Very interesting. Anyways, off topic. Sorry.
trivia with Kyle.
World Trips with Kyle. That's the podcast now.
I like researching small little tiny things.
You like? Okay, yeah. You know what? Let's move on. Okay. So, I mean, I don't know what else to talk about. I've kind of exhausted like
See, the
everything.
thing is, I was going to say, you say let's move on, but it's kind of like I was saying earlier. The major things that I would want to talk about this show aren't necessarily things that are like specifically tied to the show.
Yeah,
like, a lot
I
of
mean,
the things that I want to talk about are topics that the show brings up, but other things are discussing these topics as well. The show is very much just about different paths one can take down through life, and sort of not trying to chase this sort of idealized life, but being content with what you have, and being able to make the most and make fun out of what you have, instead of going for this rose-colored, reality that doesn't actually exist.
Yeah, and I mean, when you put it that way, I mean, I feel like this is one of those shows that if we wanted to, we could talk about like everything in these episodes. Like we could go on for hours, probably. Like
Yeah,
forever.
we'd get another death parade.
We really, I mean, which is interesting, but I mean, there's plenty of other different things that we could go on about.
I mean, I feel like I could go on for hours just about the way that the time mechanic works in this series, and how events still occur even though he is not a part of them. And how does that even work, especially when some of them are a little bit more dependent on him being there? Just mind-boggling, and I would love to talk about that, but that would also take an incredibly long time.
Yeah, and we could talk about these things, but they don't require that much time.
Yeah.
No, and to be honest, I feel like we covered what we wanted to talk about in this show. Just a general consistency on the show. It's very fascinating show, incredibly unique. First episode's a bitch to get through, but it's good.
Yeah, it's definitely worth the payoff.
That's the
if you
thing.
stick with it.
Yeah.
Like I'm super happy I finally got to go through this.
I'm super happy you recommended this to me.
And again, I still can't believe it took me this long to fucking watch this show. I've known about this thing for years, and I just never got around to it.
I've known about it for a while, but
there was this opportunity always dangling in front of me, but I just never took it.
Oh no! Jeez. No, the meta commentary.
All right, so if there's nothing else, I guess we'll catch everybody on the next podcast.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bye.
All right.
Peace, y'all.
Bye.